Hi there, my name is Caitlin Bandy and this is my channel Bandy's Books, and today we are here to predict the shortlist for the Women's Prize 2024. So going into 2024, I had a goal of reading the long list for maybe one or two literary awards. In the past on BookTube, I have had the joy of watching other channels really dive into different literary awards, read the entire long list, review all the books, make predictions, things like that, and that's a lot of fun. So I kind of wanted to delve into that more myself this year, and I decided to start with the Women's Prize. And I'm kind of glad that I did, because this introduced me to a bunch of new to me authors. It put some books on my radar that I probably wouldn't have found otherwise and actually really ended up enjoying. And overall, I think that this is a pretty strong long list of books. So now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about all 16 books. I'm going to go in order of my least favorite all the way to my favorite. And then I'm going to tell you what my predictions are for the 6 books that I think are going to make the short list. Also, I just wanted to mention that I know I'm releasing this video kind of at the wire. We're only a few hours away from the announcement of which books are going to make the short list. And the reason that I'm so down to the wire is because I couldn't get all 4 of these books. They were not accessible through my library, through Libby, through any apps that I have available to me here in the States. And I couldn't even order these books. I had to ship these books in from various parts of the world. So 2 of these came in from the UK, 1 came in from the States, even though it's not released here yet, and then 1 had to be shipped down from Canada. So I was a little bit delayed in getting these 4 books, and I read them as quickly as possible so that I could get this video done. Although I'm not quite caught up yet with doing my individual book reviews. So I'm gonna get this video up since there is a deadline, and then over the next week or 2, I'm gonna be posting all of my individual reviews for every single one of these books. So if you're interested in hearing about any of them in detail, just keep your eyes peeled over the next couple weeks. So we're gonna start with my least favorite read, and we're gonna work our way to my favorite read. My least favorite read on this long list was The Blue Beautiful World by Karen Lord. This is a book that is part of a series of stories, and while it said that you can read this as a standalone, I did find myself wondering if I was missing references and bits and pieces of this story because I hadn't read the previous books set in the same universe. I did try reading this book initially and found it really dull and boring. I honestly wanted to DNF it, so I decided to pick it up on audiobook and see if that was an improvement. It really wasn't. The narration of it wasn't bad, but the content of the story I couldn't get myself interested. I kept waiting for something poignant to happen, something memorable, something that would make me understand why the judges put this on the long list. And at the end of the day, I still don't really understand this one. This is a book that is extremely discordant with the rest of the books on the long list. It doesn't really make sense to me. Overall, I just don't really get this one, and I will be shocked if this ends up on the shortlist. Next in the books that I didn't really enjoy was Hangman by Maya Binyam. I have a full-scale review up here if you're interested in hearing about this in great detail. This was a book where I really appreciated what the author was trying to do, but I don't know that this is the kind of book that I could recommend to anyone. It isn't an enjoyable read at all. You spend 90% of the book feeling confused and isolated and alienated, and then you get to the very end and it sort of makes sense why. So I thought that that aspect of it was cool, that experimental format, that confusion throughout with a purpose at the end. However, I don't know that most people will enjoy reading this. It's a slog, and if you don't know that all the payoff is at the end of the book, I feel like most people will DNF at about the 50% point. Again, creative in structure, but not necessarily the best in terms of execution. Next up is The Wren by Anne Enright. This is a book that I wanted to love. There are so many things about it that sounded interesting to me. I love that we have a grandfather who is this famous poet that took off. We have the granddaughter who idolizes him, who wants to be a writer. We have his daughter who is bitter towards him after being abandoned. And I love these like messy familial explorations, the trauma, the hurt, all of these emotions. And for some reason, I just found this book really dull. I do think that the writing was lovely in this book, but it felt very slow. It kind of plods along. I kept waiting for these like very poignant, exciting moments, and it never really did that for me. I think that this kind of was just okay for me. I wanted a lot more from it, and it just never quite delivered on what it was promising. After that, I have Restless Dolly Maunder by Kate Grenville. This book sounds really interesting in theory. We have a book about this woman who is out of her time period. She has these great ambitions. She wants to be a doctor. She wants to pursue a career. She's not really interested in marriage. And honestly, even when she's forced to get married, she sees it it more as an economic transaction than like a romantic endeavor. All things that I think I would love, things that I very much relate to, and I empathize with this woman that's stuck in a time period where women are not respected and valued. Unfortunately, Dolly Monder is not the most compelling character. She is hard to like, hard to relate to. There are definitely points where I did relate to her, but there are other points where I found her character to be very alienating. This is very historical and it is very interesting. I found this an enjoyable read, but not the deepest, the most poignant, not the most exciting, just a okay book. Then I have Western Lane by Chetna Maru. So this was an interesting book. It was probably one of the ones I was the least excited about on this entire list. And I have a full-scale review up here if you're interested. But I ended up liking this better than I expected. I was a little nervous hearing that it was all about squash, but really actually what it's about is a young girl who's grieving the loss of her mother and also her father and him grieving that same loss and kind of their relationship dynamics. So this young girl is thrust into the world of competitive squash. Her father becomes her coach. He's brutal in his training regimen. He's like encouraging her to work harder than she's ever worked. And I think both of them are really dealing with this hole that has been left by the mother who has died. The prose in this is very simple and straightforward. And the thing that I found interesting about this was that it felt the way an 11-year-old would view the world. The author doesn't use overly complex wording. She doesn't go look for her like college level vocabulary words. She just keeps it very simple and straightforward. And I think that that is a impressive effect on this book. It's being narrated by an 11-year-old and it feels like an 11-year-old is narrating it to you. I won't say that this is the most exciting book, and I will say that it is kind of predictable. We have a very tried and true arc of young girl goes through adversity, pursues a accomplishment, has a barrier to that accomplishment, and then ends up succeeding. So you can kind of see where this story is going before you've even started really reading it. But I did think that the execution of it was pretty well done. And then I had Ordinary Human Failings by Megan Nolan. This is a book that I also thought I would really, really love. I, in fact, expected this to be up at the top of my list based on some of the reviews that I've seen by people that I have really similar reading taste to. Unfortunately, I didn't resonate with this book as much as I had hoped. I did think that this had some really interesting critiques of our perception of other people, the way that we judge elements of society. We have a crime that takes place and we see this Irish family being blamed for it just because society views them a certain type of way. And I thought that there was a lot of interesting commentary there, but I did find the book a bit dull. Again, this is one that kind of felt like it was plodding along for me. It never really found the pace that I was hoping for. I expected this to be a little bit more thrilling, a little bit more white knuckle edge of the seat, and I just found it kind of flowed along nicely. It's not a bad book by any stretch of the imagination, but compared to some of the other books on the list for me, it just felt a little bit flat. Then I had River East, River West by Abe Ray Lescure. So this was a book that I actually enjoyed, and I think I enjoyed it more than some of the other reviews I've been seeing. We have a young girl who is growing up in China. She is half Chinese and half American, and she is initially going to like a public school and receiving Chinese education, and then at one point she transfers to an expat school. So it's kind of interesting seeing her journey of trying to fit in both of these different environments. Simultaneously, we have her mother who has a relationship with their landlord, decides she's going to marry them, they're going to be a family. And these two stories kind of interweave in and out of each other. I thought it was pretty interesting. I liked that we explore some of the family dynamics, we explore some of the fitting into a culture when you're kind of in between two different cultures. There was a little bit of a mystery element going on. It probably wasn't the best book I've ever read, but I thought it did some interesting things. And I really liked that this was the reverse of like the American immigration story, because we see so many books about people wanting to immigrate to the US. I think it's like a very US centric perspective. It makes it seem like we're the only country that's exceptional. We're the only place that people want to move to. And in this book, I loved that the mom, the American mom, moved to China and fell in love and really appreciated the culture and wanted to stay there. And even with all the adversity that she faces in the story, is really dedicated to this life that she's built in China. I really enjoyed that perspective. I thought that was a little bit unique and different to a lot of the literature I see here in the US. Number 8 was The Maiden by Kate Foster. This is a sort of a literary historical fiction, and this is about a woman named Christian Nemo who was executed in 1679 for the murder of her uncle by marriage turned lover. This sounds salacious, it sounds really interesting, but I think that this book was interesting in that it didn't lean into that salaciousness. Instead, it explores the motivations of this woman, or her internal workings. It really fleshes out Christian. It talks about class and societal structures and all of these different things that affect what happens within the story. This also isn't, I think, the most accurate historical fiction. I think instead of being really rigid about the facts, it's more looking to be a good narrative story, and I think that it succeeds in that aspect. Overall, I thought this was a pretty enjoyable read, and I'm really glad because this was one of the books that I ended up having to ship in from the UK. So it took me a while to get to it, and I was waiting, and I'm like, oh gosh, I hope that the books that I get at the end are going to be worth it. After that, we have The 8 Lives of a Century-Old Trickster by Myriam Leigh. So this was a book that was kind of all over the place, but also one that I felt myself thinking about for days after reading it. This story follows a character named Ms. Mook as she is telling us about her life, the many different roles that she has taken to survive, and it's pretty impressive. It's quite the feat of storytelling. It's a little bit chaotic because it is non-linear, so we start at one random point and then kind of move back and forth through this woman's timeline. So I did find that part a little bit disorienting. This book starts during the Japanese occupation, and Ms. Mook is being forced to work in a brothel as a comfort woman. Then the Japanese leave and the United States comes in, and we have the conflict between North and South Korea, and we see that a lot of the stuff that was happening during Japanese occupation is continuing through this conflict. In particular, the first part of this book is extremely brutal. I am not somebody that is a super sensitive reader. I have read some really deeply triggering books. I don't know that I was prepared for the level of trigger in this particular book. The first half of the book almost is spent on the topic of comfort women and the forced rape of these comfort women in Korea and other parts of Asia under the Japanese occupation, and then later when the US came in as well. This is told in like unflinching detail. There is no sparing your feelings here. Everything is direct and upfront, and I felt like the story excelled the most in that part. That was probably the most compelling part of the story for me, was when she was talking about the Japanese occupation and then later the United States occupation, and then even the beginning of the North Korean regime. I felt like the story really excelled in explaining all of that. Going forward, there were bits of the story that dragged a bit for me, and there were bits that were really interesting and I felt really, really invested. I thought that the pacing was a little bit rushed throughout because this book spans almost 100 years, covers so much history. It's really ambitious in what it tries to do, and I feel like I'm impressed with how much the author put into this, but I think it might have been better executed had it been split into 2 separate books. Then I have another one of the books that I had to ship in from the UK, and that's A Trace of Sun by Pam Williams. This is about a family, and we have a young boy named Rafe who is living in Granada. His mother Scylla decides that she's going to move back to the UK. She ends up married and having a couple more kids, and it's a long while before she is financially able to send for Rafe and bring him to the UK to be with his family. Of course, there's a bunch of resentment because Rafe feels like he's been abandoned. And you have this tense family dynamic as they all try to figure out how to be family again. I thought that this was going to be mostly about family dynamics, immigration, things like that, but this delves into mental health. This delves into a lot of emotionally complex topics, and it's really well written. I really enjoyed this book. This was one that I had never heard of before, but I'm so glad that I found due to the Women's Prize list. I think that this is a really interesting read, and I'm also glad that since it was one of the books I was waiting for, that it ended up being a pretty good read as well. Then we have And Then She Fell by Alicia Elliott. This was one of the books that I was most hyped up about when I saw the long list. So we have an Indigenous woman who has recently become a mother. She's married to a white man who's really into learning about her culture, seems initially to be a relatively supportive and well-educated partner. However, as the strain of having a new child wears on her, there's this horror element that creeps into this story, and it's very unsettling. I loved the way that this was told. Then there is kind of a strange twist towards the last maybe 25% of the book. I'm still not really sure how I feel about the ending. I did think it went in kind of a strange direction, but I also appreciated what it did and how it kind of reflects on the way that we're perceiving the character and how our own personal bias could affect the way that we perceive the character. I thought that that was a really interesting thing to examine. I loved the inclusion of Mohawk culture, and I also really appreciated the discussion around privilege and partners failing to live up and be good allies. And then I have another book that I was waiting to receive. This is In Defense of the Act by Ify Black, and I had to ship this in from Canada. So this is a book that is all about suicide. We have a character named Jessica who is researching the topic of suicide, and she is coming to believe that suicide is not always a bad thing. This book is really quirky and interesting. There is some dark humor in this. It is not as bleak as it sounds. Like when you tell somebody that this entire book is about suicide, you would think it would be a really depressing read, and I didn't find it that depressing. One of the things that really struck me at the beginning of this book is there's this scene where she is talking about spider research and how you have this whole group of spiders where the female spiders kill themselves when they are no longer able to reproduce. Except they found when they isolated the postmenopausal spiders away from the other younger female spiders, the postmenopausal spiders no longer killed themselves and actually thrived. I found that so interesting. And there was just all these little factoids and just meaty things throughout this book that made this such an interesting and unique read. I think that this is a book that most people will enjoy. I'm sure there are a handful that are not going to like it, that might find it a bit glib, but overall, I feel like that this will be a pretty well-received book, and I hope that it gets a lot of attention. This is from a small press, so I'm excited to see it doing so well. Then I have Enter Ghost by Isabella Hamad. This is a book that is set in Palestine. This book is about a woman named Sonia. She is in her late 30s. She has just had the tumultuous end of a relationship, and she has flown home to Haifa, Israel to visit her family. While she's there, she gets involved with putting on a Shakespeare play. This is a book that deals not only with Sonia's personal history, but also with the history of Israel and Palestine. This book feels extremely timely and poignant. It feels like there was a lot of heavy messaging when this book was selected, and I would be pretty surprised if it doesn't end up on the shortlist. There were times where I felt like I was maybe missing bits and pieces of this book, but overall I found the reading experience to be very enjoyable. I found the topic to be really relevant, and I appreciated that it came at it in kind of a different way with this Shakespeare play and all that that brings up. I think that most people will probably enjoy this book. Now we're getting into my top 3 books on the list, and number 3 for me was Brotherless Night by V.V. Ganeshnathan. This is a book that is about the Sri Lankan Civil War, the Tamil Tigers, and this one particular woman's role within this situation. This is a conflict that I was vaguely aware of. I was aware that Sri Lanka had a civil war. I have heard of the Tamil Tigers, but I didn't know about this conflict in any sort of deep way. A lot of this was a learning experience for me, and I love when a book can teach me while also providing me with a interesting narrative. I found our main character very compelling. I found her observations of the things going on around her very realistic. I related to her in a lot of ways. I really appreciated her rebellious nature. I appreciated her unwillingness to take no for an answer. I appreciated the way that she sees how women and just people in general are being treated and her thoughts on those things. And I felt like there were some very, very striking moments within this book. In particular, without going into significant detail, there is a scene where a suicide bombing occurs within the story. And for me, that was a scene that really, really stuck with me. When you read the lead up to this and what caused the suicide bombing, it's like the first time that I was able to put myself in the shoes of somebody that committed such an atrocious act. And you don't necessarily understand the act itself, but the motivations. There was so much complexity into this story. I thought it was really, really well written. I wouldn't be surprised to see this on the long list. And then the last of the books that I had to ship was Soldier Sailor by Claire Kilroy. This is a book that I honestly did not expect to enjoy. So first of all, I sometimes struggle with Irish authors. This is a stream of consciousness, which is something that I don't typically enjoy. It's a hard reading style for me. And this is squarely focused on being a mother and this woman's relationship with her child. I am not a mother. I will never be a mother. I have not been around a lot of little kids. I am the baby in my family. So I felt like there wasn't a lot for me to relate to in this book. Boy, was I wrong. I will just say that straight up. This was a book that was a gut punch while I was reading it. As I've mentioned, I don't necessarily relate to the topic of being a mother, but I do relate to the topic of being a frustrated woman, of having partners that don't live up to the expectations that you want them to, of being kind of forgotten about by society, of struggling through these difficult situations and these difficult moments and kind of having to survive all on your own and not receiving the support you need. This is the type of book that kind of takes feminine rage, bottles it up, and puts really pretty prose in front of it. I don't know how any woman could read this book and not feel angry and frustrated and upset and emotional by the time that she's done reading this. It's funny because the quote on the front of this says, "Every woman on earth will identify with this book. Every man will learn something urgent to his betterment. It sings with great authority about the wretched entrapment and molecular joy of motherhood. Sebastian Barry." So when I initially read that quote, I rolled my eyes, and I rolled my eyes hard, because I was like, of course, a book about motherhood, every woman has to relate to this, because, you know, all that women are supposed to do is be moms. And it was really about so much more than that. It is this very emotional exploration of a woman going to the brink of sanity and figuring out how to come back from that. I thought this was beautifully written. It's just got really lovely prose, and I think that that balances with the difficulty of a lot of the subject matter. Overall, I think that this was probably the most surprising read for me on the entire long list. And finally, my very favorite of the long list was Night Bloom by Peace Adzo Mehdi. I have a full scale review up here if you'd like to check that out. We have Akorfa and Selassie. They are cousins, but more like best friends. They grow up together, and then something happens that kind of causes this shift in their relationship dynamic. They go from being thick as thieves to super isolated from each other, and it's like awkward. They don't know how to deal with each other. Neither of them knows what exactly happened with their relationship. Akorfa heads to the United States to pursue university. Selassie stays in Ghana to pursue a career. When both of them experience personal tragedies, they're kind of forced back into each other's orbits. And I found this book really interesting. Structurally, I think this story is really unique. It tells the story twice, once from Akorfa's viewpoint and once from Selassie's viewpoint, before wrapping the two stories together to give you a interesting conclusion. I thought that it said a lot about perception, the things that we miss because we're caught up in our own minds and our own worlds. It talked a lot about women's roles in the world and what feminism means in different countries. The risks of standing up and using your voice as a tool. It was just, I thought, a really thoughtfully done book. I know some people struggled with the formatting of the book, but I personally found it well done, really interesting, really compelling, and it was a book that I gobbled up. I read it so fast. So that being said, the 6 books that I am predicting for the Women's Prize 2024 shortlist are In Defense of the Act by Effie Black, And Then She Fell by Alicia Elliott, Brotherless Night by Vivi Ganeshnathan, Enter Ghost by Isabella Hamad, Soldier Sailor by Claire Kilroy, and Night Bloom by Peace Adzo Mehdi. Aside from these 6 books being my favorite of the long list, I also think that this would be a great shortlist because it would provide a lot of balance. We have different styles of writing, we have books from many different regions around the world, we have a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different thematic exploration. I think this would make for a great reading, and I feel like with those 6 books, you'd have a little something for everybody. I could possibly see A Trace of Sun or 8 Lives of a Century-Old Trickster making it onto the shortlist in lieu of one of the other books. But overall, I'm feeling pretty strong about the 6 books that I have selected. So that being said, you have seen my thoughts on all 16 books. You've seen the books that I'm predicting for the shortlist, and I'm curious to hear what you think about it. If you liked the video, hit the thumbs up, comment down below, let me know which books you think are gonna end up on the shortlist, which books would you be like horrified to see on the shortlist, and which books will you be devastated if they don't make it through to the next round. And if you're not already subscribed to this channel, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button down below, as well as the notification bell so that you never miss a video, and that way we can see each other again soon. Thanks so much for joining. Bye.